Hello and welcome to this America 1803 to 90 revision lesson 2. If you've already done revision lesson 1, then you'll be familiar with this. If you are coming to revision lesson 2 straight away because you particularly enjoy to study Native Americans and Westward Expansion, then you will find the lesson notes template that you need in the description at the bottom of this video, and that will have links to flashcards and essay plans and other things that you might need. There will be an overview of each part of the course, and then there will be some activities to help you develop your analytical skills as well as recall the knowledge required that you need to use to actually operationalize that analysis. So let's begin. So the revision process is about 4 key steps really. It's about making some revision notes. It's about learning those notes. It's about then applying that knowledge to do some focused tasks that help you to develop the skills necessary to be successful in the exam so that you can practice planning and writing 10-mark questions and essay questions, which are the 2 questions in this particular exam. We are going to look first of all at Native Americans, and you can see underneath the heading Native Americans here there is a list of the key things from the syllabus that the exam board want us to focus on, and these should form the basis of the revision notes that you make. So we have a short film that provides an overview for the Native American aspect of the course. This is not an exhaustive account of everything you would need for this particular part of the course, but it does give you an overview. It does paint the broad picture to help jog your memory before we start doing some more in-depth revision. A crucial aspect of the Native American element of this course from 1803 to 90 is the extent to which Native American culture and lifestyle was slowly eroded and destroyed by the advance of white civilization. We know from the beginning of this course that Native Americans on the plains lived a nomadic lifestyle. They followed the buffalo. Their lifestyle was far removed from the lifestyle of white Americans and has been adapted to fit the particular climatic and environmental challenges that the Great Plains brought. We also know there were other Native Americans, like the Mandans and Hidatsa, in other areas of the United States who didn't necessarily live in a way that was nomadic and chase the buffalo, but they did live in a way that was different from white society. And yet, in that early contact with white settlers who moved into the old northwest of the United States, there was trade, there was an ability to have a relationship that was mutually beneficial. However, that relationship over time was eroded because of white demands for land and Native Americans balking at those demands for land that white people made upon them and the impingement on their lifestyle that white settlers had. And we see in 1812, in the resistance of Tecumseh, the first real attempt to galvanize Native Americans in a unified way to fight against white incursion on Native American lands and white impingement on their lifestyle. And so Native Americans fight back. Tecumseh is ultimately unsuccessful and is defeated by US forces, but it's an important first attempt by Native Americans to fight back against white demands for land, white infringement on their lifestyle. We see in the 1830s, in Black Hawk's War, in the Old Northwest, in the Seminole Wars in Florida, in the early part of the 19th century where Jackson made his name as an Indian fighter. We see attempts, and successful attempts, by white military and political forces to move Native Americans away from land that white settlers were eager to inhabit. And this leads, under Jackson's presidency in the 1830s, to the Indian removal policy and the desire to move Indians west of the Mississippi River. Particularly, this centers around the attempt to evict the Cherokee from their lands in Georgia because of the discovery of gold there. And it sees Jackson basically ignore the decisions of the Supreme Court that said that the Cherokees had a right to stay on the land, and to endorse a policy of forced removal of Native Americans that eventually leads in 1836 to the Trail of Tears, where hundreds, if not thousands, of Native Americans lose their life as they are forced from their homelands west of the Mississippi, beyond what Jackson and others envisaged as a permanent Indian frontier. And it's this process of separation, it's this process of moving Indians away from white society which dominates the policy towards Native Americans in the 1830s and the 1840s. However, this changes after the Mexican-American War and the discovery of gold in California, as Native Americans then are in the way because of the fact that white settlers are flooding across the plains. That leads to the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1851 and the Indian Appropriations Act, which is the beginning of a reservation policy. It's the beginning of Native Americans being moved onto reservations, onto land away from white settlers. And it's the beginning also when we see the Homestead Act in the 1860s, and the Pacific Railroad Act is also signed in 1862. It's the beginning of people moving and settling on the plains, which shrinks the land available to Native Americans even further. So what we see in the first 50 years or so of this course, the 1803 to the 1860s, is we see a process by which slowly, and then with increasing pace after 1860, but slowly in the period 1803 to 1860, Native Americans are moved off land, are faced by white settlers who want to inhabit the land that they have been inhabiting as white settlers, as the advance of white civilization increases and as new land is found and resources on that land are found that white Americans want. Now, in the 1860s, during the Civil War, with the best troops away fighting in the Civil War, Native Americans find an opportunity to push back against the expansion of white society, and it's during the 1860s that we see the beginning of the Indian Wars that last into the 1870s. And in these Indian Wars, there is a general cycle of conflict whereby Native Americans sign some form of treaty with white authorities. Oftentimes that confines them to a reservation in promise for money or in promise for resources, especially food. And what happens is that money, or the white government's or white authorities' end of the bargain, is not kept up. Native Americans then move off the reservation in order to search for food, or in order to exact retribution on local white populations. This then leads to the army being called, it leads to conflict, it leads to the signing of another treaty. And we see this in Little Crow's War, we see this in Red Cloud's War, and we see in 1864 in the Sand Creek Massacre the consequence of some of the more experienced military personnel being away fighting in the Civil War. And when the management of Indian affairs is left to local people, this often leads to more violence and more brutal treatment of Native Americans, as was the case in the Sand Creek Massacre. And as the 1860s turn to the 1870s, and as the Civil War ends, and there is a desire to exploit the resources in the West, then that leads to increased conflict with Native Americans and an increased drive to force Native Americans onto reservations. It is this desire to force the Sioux onto reservations after the discovery of gold in the Black Hills that leads to the Battle of Little Bighorn, and it leads to the slaughter of Custer and his men in 1876. This shocks white authorities and shocks the white population back in the East, and it prompts a desire to force all Native Americans onto reservations and to show little mercy towards those Native Americans, and that leads to a concerted effort to defeat Native Americans. Tactics of total warfare learnt in the Civil War, destroying resources, attacking Native Americans in their winter camps, tracking them, hunting them down. All of this is done to force Native Americans onto reservations. By this point, the buffalo are all but extinct because of the practices of hunters, because of the expansion of the railroad, which destroyed the usual migration patterns of the buffalo. And in many areas of government, there was a tacit acknowledgement that the destruction of the buffalo was an important way of controlling Native Americans and requiring them to be on reservations where they were reliant on the government to feed them. Generally speaking, there was less sympathy for Native Americans in the West than there was in the East. The people in the West who had dealings with Native Americans, who wanted their land, who wanted to exploit the resources that they thought Native Americans were stopping them from exploiting, were more inclined to have a violent attitude towards Native Americans, whereas those in the East were more inclined to want to civilize Native Americans and to assimilate them. And what we see on the reservations in the 1870s and into the 1880s are conditions that were terrible for Native Americans. There was high levels of alcoholism and drug abuse. There was high levels of suicide. Native American culture and lifestyle had been destroyed during the course of the Indian Wars and during the relentless forcing of Native Americans onto reservations away from their traditional hunting grounds and the traditional lifestyles. And reformers in the East, often Christian humanitarian reformers who had a very paternalistic attitude towards the Native Americans, saw that the reservations were not working. If the aim of the reservations was to put Native Americans in a place where they could learn how to be like white people, that was not working. They were simply, the reservations, separating Native Americans from white people and leaving them in terrible conditions. So out of this Christian humanitarian impulse to assimilate the Native Americans came the Dawes Act of 1887, came the policies of forced removal of Indian children from the reservations, sending them to boarding schools like the Carlisle Indian School in Pennsylvania. And this drive to assimilate in the Dawes Act was about trying to make Native Americans like farmers. They were given plots of land. They were encouraged to divide the land up so that individual land ownership was the norm rather than tribal collective land usage. And all of this was an attempt to assimilate Native Americans. And so in many respects, even though the impulse for this was paternalistic, even though the impulse for this was to try and help, in inverted commas, Native Americans become more like white Americans, in many respects the Dawes Act continued the oppression of Native Americans that had been begun by the Indian Wars and the forcing of them onto reservations. It was simply a different type of oppression. It was simply a different type of destruction of Native American lifestyle and culture. And tragically and symbolically, the final nail in the coffin of Native American culture and lifestyle as it had once been comes in 1890 at the Massacre at Wounded Knee, where surrendering Native Americans are mown down, where their leader Bigfoot is found tangled dead in the snow. And the end date of this course, 1890, I think was partly chosen because of this symbolic moment at Wounded Knee, which signifies the end of any sort of final resistance of Native Americans to the reservation policy, and it shows the complete and utter suppression of Native American life as it once had been. Ultimately, it was the desire of white Americans to inhabit the land that Native Americans inhabited that was the ultimate cause of the reasons for conflict between Native Americans and white Americans, and was the ultimate reason why Native Americans and white Americans could not live peacefully. The cultural differences, the religious differences, the difference in economic and political models of the two societies were significant and contributed to the reasons why the two groups could not live amongst each other or alongside each other peacefully. But ultimately, it was the desire for land that was the cause of conflict. You will find on the third page of your lesson notes template the first of three, and the other two obviously follow straight after, knowledge revision organizers. Now, you can use these alongside the little film that you've just watched to help to create your own revision notes. And you should frame those revision notes around the key issues that are listed below the Native Americans section here, because any exam questions that are asked have to be directly related to those key issues that are taken from the syllabus. So making your own revision notes and then learning the notes, the first two steps on that arc of the revision process, are really the fundamentals. That's what you need to do. You need to make your own revision notes. You need to learn them, and you learn them simply by just doing some read, cover, write, and check. Simple memory work to try and get that information to stick in your mind. The next stage of the revision process is then to start to apply some of that material to some 10-mark questions. That's the first question that you have to do in the exam. We can see here which had the greatest consequence for Native Americans in the years 1861 to 90. Was it the Indian Wars or was it the Dawes Act? So the key is to focus on a direct analysis of the consequence for Native Americans of each thing, and then to weigh them up and reach a judgment about which had the greatest consequence. We can probably predict the focus of future questions, looking at the most destructive impact on Native American culture, the most significant reason for loss of land, the most significant reason for the inability of Native Americans and white people to live together peacefully, the most powerful impact on the assimilation process that Native Americans endured, the most successful method of resistance to white power. So you're going to use the flashcards, and there's a link to those flashcards on the page there at the bottom. And you would use each flashcard that's relevant to a particular question focus that's listed in the bullet points there, and you would try and weigh up which is the most important. So you got Dawes Act and Wounded Knee here. Which one of those was most significant in destroying Native American culture? You can start to annotate on your flashcards. You can start to compare the relative importance of each of the flashcards in relation to each of the bullet point focus for potential questions. That way, you are starting to use your knowledge to develop some analysis, and your knowledge is being used to support that analysis and evaluation rather than your knowledge just being used to tell a story or to describe events. Now, a key aspect of this course is the ability to analyze, and you will find this page here in your lesson notes template. If you've done the revision lesson 1, you'll be familiar with this stuff. Different propositions, different questions for you to analyze and try and weigh up evidence for and against in order to develop a sense of argument and a sense of analysis and start to use the knowledge that you have learned in the recall element of the revision process. If we look at this as a particular example, land was the key reason for conflict between whites and Native Americans. Well, undoubtedly land was a key reason. You could argue that land was the main reason. The fact that Native Americans were nomadic and didn't see land as something that could be owned and a resource that could be tapped in the same way as white America was undoubtedly crucial to the conflict between whites and Native Americans. The gold being found in California, the gold being found in the Black Hills, the gold being found in Georgia, leading to the removal of the Cherokee and the Trail of Tears. Land was crucial, and there is no getting away from that every time white people encroached on land that Native Americans traditionally inhabited, there was conflict. However, possibly underlying the reason for that conflict based on land was a cultural difference between whites and Native Americans. And that cultural difference was built on the idea that white people felt that their civilization and their sedentary lifestyle and their way of living was superior to Native Americans. So there was a cultural element that underpinned the conflict over land. There was also a racial element that underpinned the conflict. And for many white Americans, Native Americans were racially inferior, and so the way in which they treated Native Americans was informed by that nascent racism that lay at the heart of American society. So, yeah, land was key. Of course it was. But maybe there was something sitting underneath the dispute about land which may have been a more primary cause of the conflict between whites and Native Americans. And so it's that type of analysis that I've just rehearsed there that is crucial to success in essay questions, because we know that the main drive of essays is argument and analysis and how knowledge is being used to consistently evaluate and analyze, not describe knowledge. Knowledge is not being used to tell a story. Knowledge is being used to support an argument and some analysis. You have in your lesson notes template this list of potential essay questions on Native Americans 1803 to 90, and they are there for you to practice some planning and to practice some writing of essays. And you also see a link to the essay plans. So there is an essay plan for each one of these questions. These plans are not the definitive answer. It is not the case that if your plan or your answer does not look exactly like this, then it is not a good answer. The important thing is the italicized bits at the bottom of each section, that this plan has a clear argument and analysis that runs through it. And it's this sort of argument and analysis that you should be developing in your essay planning. You should be rehearsing your arguments and your analysis. And of course, you can cross-reference that with some of the examples that exist, and you have a link to access those in your lesson notes booklet. Right, that brings us to the end of this section of the revision video that focused on Native Americans 1803 to 90. There is no expectation that you are going to sit down now for hours and hours and hours in one go and do all of the tasks that have been described. The point is that this video is to talk you through the revision process, and that process starts with making your own revision notes and learning them before you then move on to starting to apply that knowledge and to do some practice that helps you develop some skills of analysis that then leads in time to you doing some full essay plans and developing and rehearsing some arguments in relation to some key questions. Okay, here is an overview of the American Westward Expansion aspect of this course. And again, it's not exhaustive. It's not everything that you need to know for the Westward Expansion aspect of the course, but it does provide an overview which will jog your memory before you start doing some more in-depth revision and trying to apply some knowledge to some analytical tasks. The element of the 1803 to 90 course that focuses on westward expansion really is a story of the reasons why and how the West was opened up to settlement, and then the consequences for the United States of that opening up of the West for settlement. The beginning of the course in 1803, we see the Louisiana Purchase. Now, without the Louisiana Purchase, there would be no westward expansion. The Louisiana Purchase makes it possible for the United States to then grow in terms of its geographic size, its landmass, and it's the Louisiana Purchase that opens up the possibility of new lands for people to move to. One of the other things that we must focus on in this westward expansion element of the course is why this westward expansion happened. Was it to do with improved technology, communication? Was it to do with individuals, organisations? Was it to do with the government? And certainly in the case of the Louisiana Purchase, and later on in terms of the Mexican cession after the Mexican-American War of 1846-48, that land, the existence of a place to migrate to in the West, would not have been without American government policy that encouraged that, and without American government policy that ceded land from other countries. And so therefore government policy is important in opening up the West from the very beginning. But what's also important is the exploration and the determination of individuals. It was Lewis and Clark who mapped the West and who mapped the Louisiana Purchase. The development of the Cumberland Road and early railways, that steamships, all of these technological advances helped with the opening up of the West. And there were several push and pull factors that encouraged people to move west. So push factors: there was an economic depression in 1837 which made people feel like they wanted to try and carve out a new life somewhere different. For the Mormons in the 1830s, they were pushed away from their place in the East because of religious persecution. But there were also tremendous pull factors. The development of the Oregon Trail in the 1830s meant, and the publication of that spoke of the possibilities in Oregon, the better farming conditions, the better, more fertile soil that made it easier to farm there than in other areas. The ultimate pull factor was the California gold rush of the 1849-1850 period, where gold being discovered in California caused thousands of settlers to go and seek a better life in the West. And ultimately, economic motive in one way or the other was a driving force for westward expansion. The promise of a better life, of a more economically prosperous life in the West than in the East, was what motivated a lot of westward expansion. And there was government policy that encouraged that. Things like the Preemption Act in 1841 that allowed people to buy the land that they squatted on in the West. So there's a combination of government policy allowing people, creating the opportunity for people to move west, in the first part of the 19th century, but then there's the economic motive and the desire of individuals to carve out a better life for themselves because of the potential economic benefits of moving west as opposed to staying in the east. And that interplay of those two factors is really important to understand when we think about how and why the West was opened up to settlement before the American Civil War, how and why people moved west and were able to carve out a life for themselves, carve out an existence in the West. But at the same time that this is going on, we obviously know that westward expansion was causing some negative consequences for the United States. This westward expansion, the Mexican cession, the wrangling over the northwest portion of the Louisiana Purchase is all part of the sectional tension that America experiences in the lead up to the Civil War. And it's that sectional tension, the tension between North and South, which is sparked in many ways by westward expansion, about is the West going to be slave or free. And it's that tension that also helps to inhibit the true development of the West. It's no surprise that the 1862 Homestead Act and the 1862 Pacific Railroad Act are passed during the Civil War, when Southern Democrats have seceded from the Union, when Congress is dominated by the Republican Party and their free soil vision for the West. They passed those pieces of legislation which map out where the Transcontinental Railroad is going to be built, connecting America from the Pacific to the Atlantic, and also they passed the Homestead Act, providing homesteads for free soil farmers in the West. These two acts in 1862 are tremendously important for the development of the West. Railroads are undoubtedly the engine of economic expansion and the engine of the expansion of settlement in the West. The railroads provided an incredibly important transportation and communication revolution, and in many respects, as one historian has suggested, railroads in America and railroads in the American West were the internet of the 19th century. They helped to connect East and West and make a national economic model. The Homestead Act and the Morrill Land Act providing training for homesteaders. The Homestead Act is very important because it establishes the beginning of real settlement on the plains. Whereas previously the plains were seen as uninhabitable, the Homestead Act encourages people to settle on the plains and changes the dynamic of Western settlement. And that Homestead Act is possible to conceive of people settling on the plains because of the improved communication and transportation that is developed because of the expansion of the railroad, but also because of the development of different farming techniques. And when we're thinking about the reasons why the West was settled, again, we need to think about the interplay of different factors. So the government put in place legislation to encourage homesteading, to encourage the development of a transcontinental railroad. But it was the development of that railroad, it was the desire of the two companies building the railroad to profit from it, the desire of those two companies to encourage people to move west that sparked increased settlement. And it was also the courage and the tenacity and the perseverance of homesteaders to live on their farms, to carve out an existence for themselves in what had once been seen as a wilderness, that was incredibly important for the settlement of the West. And what further came out of the 1860s of the Civil War was the development of the cattle industry. When people returned to Texas after the Civil War and found thousands upon thousands upon thousands of cattle that had been breeding in Texas that were worth very little in the South, they found there was a growing market for the beef provided by that cattle in the East, in the Northeast. And so The development of the cattle industry with the long drives to cow towns like Abilene before cattle was shipped off to the east came out of the Civil War also. So this period of the 1860s is a really important time in America. The Civil War is raging in the east, but decisions are being taken in the east, and the consequences of that war are also important for the development of the West. We talked about the California Gold Rush as being the archetypal pull factor example for westward expansion. And unlike the other elements that were driving westward expansion, so railroads, homesteading, the cattle industry, whereby the movement was from east to west, where homesteaders forged a place for themselves on the plains. The railroads moved from east to west and connected communities in the east with communities in the west. The cattle industry was about driving cattle up to the west to move then to the east. The cattle industry developed from there, with more and more cattle ranches being developed in places like Montana and big ranches on the plains. So that was about a movement from east to west. But starting with the California Gold Rush as the beginning of the impact of mining on westward expansion, what we see is mining moving from west to east. So that California Gold Rush is then followed by the discovery of gold in other parts of the United States, and there is a movement from the west back to the east. So mining and homesteading and railroads and the cattle industry are all important for driving settlement of the West, and they are interconnected alongside government encouragement for people to settle in the West, government legislation and government policy of expansion, which enabled the possibility for settlement in the West. Now, all of this, on the surface of it, appears to be incredibly positive for the United States, and certainly not only in an economic sense, not only in a sense of being able to exploit the vast array of natural resources, but also in terms of developing an American national identity. Then the movement west can be seen as very positive for the United States. When the frontier is closed in the 1890s, and Frederick Jackson Turner, the historian, talks about the frontier thesis when the frontier is closed, this idea of Americans trying to move to the next frontier, the idea of Americans trying to make a success in the wilderness, was important for forging a sense of the American character, and it's become a part of the American national identity, and it's become a part of the American foundation myth, and a sense of American exceptionalism comes from the development of the American West. And that can all be seen as a positive consequence of westward expansion. However, there are also considerable negative consequences of westward expansion. The Civil War we've talked about, so the way in which westward expansion acted as a cause or a partial cause for the Civil War, the way in which the question of whether the West was going to be slave or free caused sectional tension, that's a hugely negative consequence of that westward expansion. The environmental damage done by mining, the mining towns that sprung up, exploited the resources of those areas and then left. The environmental consequences of the timber companies, the environmental consequences of cattle industry and how that tended to cause tension between different stakeholders in the West. There are economic and environmental damages caused by the movement west. The problems of law and order, the problems of violence in the West, and the impact that had on American culture and on identity, and of course the massively negative consequence of westward expansion on the lives of Native Americans. while we sometimes speak, or popular history speaks, of the winning of the West, well, the West was also lost, and it was lost by Native Americans, and it was forcibly taken from them. The oppression of Native Americans and the destruction of their lifestyle was a hugely negative consequence of westward expansion. So if we think about this 1803 to 90 time period, and we think about the motivation or the catalytic factors for the expansion westward, then we are thinking about an interplay of factors. We're thinking about the role of the federal government. We are thinking about transport and communication improvements. We're thinking about the economic opportunity that is sought by individuals and organizations, by homesteaders, by railroad companies, by mining companies. But we're also thinking about the consequences of this westward expansion. And while for some the consequences were incredibly positive, for others the consequences were incredibly negative. And for the United States as a whole, one of the consequences of westward expansion was undoubtedly the Civil War. America had to decide whether or not the West was going to be slave or free, and that led to a civil war. However, having fought that war and made that decision, the consequences for the United States of the closing of the frontier were seen as positive, not only because it allowed America to exploit the natural resources in the 19th century, would enable them to become an economic superpower in the 20th century, but also that shared experience of conquering the wilderness, of defeating the frontier, was incredibly positive, because it kind of created a myth, an identity that Americans could collectively coalesce around. And yet still, the negative consequence of westward expansion can be seen in the way in which Chinese Americans, to a certain extent Irish Americans, African Americans, Native Americans, and others have been excluded from that story of the progress of westward expansion, or have been irreparably damaged by it. Alright, you'll find in your lesson notes template that you have the knowledge organizers that you should have seen before for westward expansion. There are 3 of them, and they are going to form the basis of the core knowledge alongside your own class notes that you need in order to develop your revision notes. So the key aspects of the westward expansion course that appear in the syllabus that the exam board want us to focus on are listed underneath the westward expansion heading here, and so you should use what you've seen, your class notes, your knowledge organizers, revision organizers, to do the first 2 stages of this revision process. You've got to make your own revision notes, so you've got to make them under those headings so you know that you've covered all the things that the exam board are going to potentially ask you about. And then you've got to learn the notes, and that's simply read them, cover them, write them, check to see what you got right, and keep repeating that process until you get the knowledge cemented in your head. Now, obviously that's the first thing that you're going to have to do as part of the revision process, but I'm also going to talk you through how you can apply that the 3rd and 4th stage of the revision process, so that once you've completed your revision notes, you're able to move on and apply that knowledge. So we know that the first question on the exam is a 10-mark question. Here is an example from the westward expansion section of the course. Which of the following was of greater significance in opening up the West to settlement in the period after 1861? We've got the Homestead Act, we've got the Morrill Act. So therefore, the focus needs to be on which of those was more significant, which of those were more responsible for facilitating that opening up of the West. If we consider the focus of future questions, then we could have stuff like significance of settling the West, significance in encouraging the migration westwards, consequences of the settlement of the West, importance in helping to overcome the barriers to settling the West, the importance as a barrier itself to the settlement of the West. So you can use your flashcards, and there is a link at the bottom of the page there in your lesson notes booklet to those flashcards. You can use the flashcards to help you prepare arguments and analysis in relation to the potential focus of questions in the future. Obviously, not all of the flashcards are relevant to or appropriate when answering some of the different focus of the question that is on the bullet point list that you've just seen. So, for example, technology and communication here, they are not barriers to westward expansion, but they are responsible for aiding westward expansion and aiding the settlement of the West. So you can start to think about which of the factors are more or less important in relation to a particular issue, and you can start to annotate them and start to rehearse some arguments and start to think about how you can deal with this information in an analytical way rather than just recalling the information. And that leads us to this page. And if you've worked your way through the sectional tension, the Civil War, the Native Americans, and now you're doing the Westward Expansion section, you're going to be well familiar with this by now. The idea of how we analyze. So analyze that, a series of assertions or questions, and we need to start to think about how we would use the knowledge that we have developed through our revision note making, how we would use that to analyze in a way that is going to serve us best when it comes to answering essay questions. And we know how important analysis is because of what it says in the top levels of the mark scheme, that what makes a successful essay is accurate and detailed knowledge and understanding, but it's how that knowledge and understanding is demonstrated throughout the answer and is consistently evaluated and analysed in order to reach a judgment. So it's the analysis of the material that is more important than the simple regurgitation of the material itself. So if we have a look here at an example of an analysed task, we've got push factors were more crucial to migration than pull factors. Well, push factors were important because of the financial panic of 1837, because of some soil exhaustion in the Old Northwest, because of some religious persecution of the Mormons. Of course, push factors were important, and of course, hard times in the East were a motivating factor for people to try and find a better existence in the West. But in reality, pull factors were probably more crucial. Pull factors were more crucial because they were the promise of something new and the promise of something better. And that's probably a more powerful motivating factor for people than the problems that existed in the East. So manifest destiny, the opportunity opened up by the Oregon Trail, the gold rush, cheap land, Homestead Act, the encouragement from railroad companies who stood to make money from more people moving west, and the advertising that they did of a land of plenty, of loads of opportunity. It was pull factors that were more important than push factors. Ultimately, if life in the East was problematic, if life in the East was difficult for people, then there needed to be something attractive, something better in the West. And without that something better, then there wouldn't have been the pull to make people leave the East and travel to the West. And it's that sort of analytical tone, that sort of argumentative style, using the knowledge to drive forward analysis and argument that you need to use when answering essays. Here are some example essay questions, and there is a link at the bottom of the page on your lesson notes document to the lesson plans that have already been prepared in response to these questions. And again, the essay plans, they are not the definitive answer. It is not that you're trying to match up what you write and what you plan with what I have written and what I have planned. It is just to get a sense of the analytical tone and structure of answers, the clear argument which is reinforced with the analysis at the end of each section that would be written, and that's indicated by the italicized stuff there, which is driving the argument forward. And it's that skill that you need to practice, that skill of analysis and argument and driving an argument forward by using knowledge in an analytical way. That is the absolute ball game for answering these essay style questions. And there we have it. That's the end of this revision lesson section on Westward Expansion. Again, I don't expect that you're going to go through each stage of the process and sit down for hours on end and complete all of the tasks. This provides a roadmap for how you can revise Westward Expansion and all the other aspects of the course in a staged process. Okay, I hope you have enjoyed that lesson. I hope it's useful. Of course, you can come back to these lessons, you can come back to the resources, and you can do the tasks several times. The more that you go over the material, the more knowledgeable you will be, and the more that you practice the skills of analysis, then the more successful you will be when answering both 10-mark and essay questions. So, until next time, take care, stay safe, goodbye.